The fact that the only way that I could make it was if my plea brothers were there to push me. And the only way that they could make it was if I was there to push them. And finally, by the end of that first year, I was actually doing okay academically and doing okay militarily, and I was allowed to play sports because I wasn't on probation anymore, so I was doing pretty well athletically. And for the first time in my life, when people asked my mother, how's Wes doing, she could say he's doing well and not be lying. And that meant something. And so finally I ended up finishing high school there. I joined the Army right out of high school. I went on to community college and then went on to Johns Hopkins. And it was while I was at Johns Hopkins that the larger idea behind this book and story came about. Because the day after I received the Rhodes Scholarship, the Baltimore Sun, which is my hometown paper, wrote a piece about my childhood and my life and how I had quite a few issues in my life. But through a lot of help and support, I just received this award. And at the same time, they were running a whole series on 4 guys who one day walked into a jewelry store at 11:30 in the morning. The first 2 guys walked into the jewelry store, and as soon as they walked into the store, they reached in their coats and they pulled out guns. And they screamed for everybody to get on the ground, and everybody did. Everybody who was working and shopping inside the store. And then a few seconds later, 2 other guys with mallets then followed them in and came into the store. And one guy with a gun and one guy with a mallet went to the left, and one guy with a gun and one guy with a mallet went to the right. And the ones with the guns were keeping everybody on the ground, while the ones with the mallets were walking around and just smashing out jewelry cases and taking out watches and rings and necklaces. And finally they met at the back of the store with a little over $400,000 worth of jewelry. And one of the guys yelled, "Let's go," and then all 4 guys then ran out of the store. And one of the people that was inside the store that day was an off-duty police officer who was moonlighting as a security guard. This off-duty police officer was a 13-year veteran of the Baltimore Police Force. He was a 3-time recipient of Police Officer of the Year. He was a father of 5 who just had triplets. And the reason he was working that day was because he needed to make extra money for his family. And he got up off the ground, and he drew his weapon, and he ran outside to see if he could stop him from getting away. And as he went outside, he started kneeling next to cars and kneeling next to vehicles to see if he could figure out where they were. And he didn't realize that one of the vehicles that he was kneeling next to was one of the vehicles that the guys were in. And then a window rolled down, and then 3 shots were taken point-blank range. And he was killed instantly. And there's a 12-day national manhunt for those 4 guys. And finally, after 12 days, all 4 were caught. And one of the people that the police were looking for, one of the people that was eventually arrested and tried and convicted for the crime, was a guy whose name was also Wes Moore. And the more I learned about the other Wes Moore, the more I realized how much more we had in common than just our names. The fact that we were both living in the same neighborhoods, literally at that point we were living blocks away from each other. The fact that we both grew up in single-parent households, we both had academic and disciplinary troubles growing up, we were around the same age. And it started making me think, so how does this happen? How do you get 2 kids with similar backgrounds and similar circumstances that end up going in 2 completely different places? That as I'm getting ready to head 3,000 miles away from home on a full scholarship, he's getting ready to head 25 miles away from home to a maximum security facility for the rest of his life. Him, his older brother, and 2 other guys who were there that day. And I knew there were questions I wanted to ask, and he was the only one that could answer them. So one day I just decided to write him. I had no idea if he'd write back, and I knew I couldn't control what he did. But I knew I wanted to write him and see if I could get some of these answers. And then a month later, I received a letter back from Jessup Correctional Institution from Wes Moore. And it was one of the things when I first opened that letter, if it was written in crayon, like he wrote it with his whole hand and it didn't make any sense, I almost feel like I would have received that letter and I would have gotten it. I would have said, okay, I understand, I get it. The problem is that it wasn't. The problem was, to this day, it's one of the most interesting and articulate letters that I've ever received. And eventually that one letter turned into dozens of letters, those dozens of letters turned into dozens of visits, and now I've known Wes for over 7 years. And when I was first approached about this idea of actually turning this into a book, I'd known Wes for years before the idea of a book even came about. And when I had a friend of mine who came up to me and said, when she knew about the story that I'd gotten in the West, she said, I think there's something larger here. I think you should turn it into a book. And I said, you know what, I'm not at all interested in it. I felt like I don't have time for it. I don't want to dig that deeply into Wes's life, and I don't want to dig that deeply into my own life. And there were two things that pushed me to say that this is worth going for. The first thing was I thought of a quote by a gentleman named Edmund Burke. And Edmund Burke once said, all it takes for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. And then I thought about something that Wes told me. When I talked to Wes about it, he said, listen, I've wasted every opportunity I've ever had in life. And I'm going to die now. And if you can do something to help people understand the consequences for their decisions, and also do something to help people understand the neighborhoods that these decisions are being made in, then I think you should do it. This book in no way is some type of revisionist history. This book in no way tries to create sympathizers or reopen cases or stimulate appeal processes. Wes's fate is sealed. He will spend the rest of his life in a 6x8 cell. The question I wanted to ask was, why was his fate sealed so long before February 7, 2000? And what can we all understand? And what can we all learn from it? And what can we do to help keep these tragedies from ever having to happen? And the questions come up with what's that? So what is that difference? What is the one thing that if you give a child this, that they'll be fine? The one thing that if you give a child that they'll be okay? And the answer is that there is no one thing. Raising kids is extraordinarily complicated. And when you happen to be raising children in some of the most precarious communities in our country, then it becomes that much more difficult. But I know there are a lot of things that matter. I know education matters. I know expectations matter. And I know you matter. All of you, all of us matter. One of my greatest frustrations is sometimes I feel like we look at situations that exist in communities and situations that exist in our society, and then we all end up looking and pointing to figure out whose job it is to solve it. We look and we say, well, that's the mayor's job. That's the city council's job. That's the senator's job. That's the president's job. That's whoever's job. And never once taking a real estimate on our own potency as citizens. Never once understanding that there's not a single situation, there's not a single problem that we have in our community that with our own collective effort, our own collective resources, our own collective time, our intellectual capital, and our energy that we can't figure out. That's why being here is so important. Because if you look at this room alone, if you look just here, right here, in this environment right here, there's not a single situation that anyone in Indianapolis, or Marion, or Gary, or anywhere else in this state or nationwide couldn't figure out. So the larger question becomes, will we? The larger question becomes, will we take that personal responsibility and that personal accountability to actually make that difference? To actually be part of that larger solution? After studying life in the other West more, I know this, is that the chilling truth is that his story could have been mine. And the tragedy is that my story could have been his. Had it not been for people who believed in the idea of second chances, had it not been for people who saw something in me that quite honestly I didn't even see it myself at that time, had it not been for people who fought and who advocated and who quite honestly treated me more like family than even many family members did, I know how different things could have ended up. And I think if all of us look at our own individual lives, we all know that we're all products of second chances. and third chances, and fourth chances, in my case. But at some point, there was a larger belief in us. There was a larger belief about us as to what we could do. That responsibility is extraordinarily real. And now that we have an ability to actually do something about it, now that we have an ability to help out organizations that deal with juvenile justice or mental health or whatever it is that you want to have as your passion, you've got to do it. Because the days of waiting around and waiting for other people to figure out our problems, not only are they done, they will never hear. There's not a single thing that we can't solve as long as we're willing to do it. I want to quickly, I want to close real quick with a story about a colonel that I had in military school. He was the commandant of cadets, and he was a 3-time Vietnam veteran, and this guy was as tough as nails. I mean, his name was Colonel Billy G. Murphy. And I swear, I think I saw him smile once, and I think it was an accident. And, but he was losing a lot of weight. And one day he called the entire Corps of Cadets together, and he explained to us that he had cancer, and he had to leave the school. And the entire Corps of Cadets was sitting inside the chapel while he stood at the pulpit. And he said something to us that day that I will never forget. He said, when it's time for you to leave here, whether it's time for you to leave this school, whether it's time for you to leave your community, whether it's time for you to leave your job, when it's time for you to leave this planet, make sure that it mattered that you were ever here. Make sure that it mattered that you were ever here. No one has ever promised any of us anything. I learned very early on in life that no one has ever said to me, Wes, you've got 1,652 more days left here, so you can go ahead and pace yourself. No one knows. So the importance of making sure every day that we're doing our part to make sure that it matters that you're ever here becomes crucial. Because fundamentally, that's all we're ever asked to do. Fundamentally, that's the only thing we're ever called to task for. And as long as we're doing that, we're doing our part. As long as we're simply doing that, we're fulfilling our destiny. So I thank you not only for being attentive and being here, but for all you stand for and all you do. Not just for your gifts, but for your example. Because of the hard work that you put in every day, you're making it matter that you were ever here. And it's appreciated. So thank you so much. Bless you all for all you do. Thank you so much.